He only looked for a second, and it was enough to change both their lives forever. Elias Crow had spent 10 years making sure nothing unexpected ever crossed his land. Not a stranger, not a stray thought, not even a memory he hadn't already buried. And every morning followed the same rhythm: boots on dry wood, saddle leather creaking, the long mile ride out to the narrow creek that barely held a foot of water this late in the season, just enough to reflect the sky and remind him the world hadn't ended while he wasn't looking. And that morning should have been no different. Same dust, same wind, same silence stretching for miles like a promise he intended to keep, until he heard something that didn't belong. A shift in the water, too careful to be an animal, too quiet to be chance. And Elias stopped his horse without thinking, his hand resting loose near his side, not reaching for anything, just listening, because out here, listening was the difference between trouble and peace. And when he stepped closer, just one step past the cottonwood shadow, he saw her, Clara Whitlock, standing knee-deep in the creek, sunlight breaking across the surface and catching on her shoulders as she turned just enough for him to realize he wasn't meant to be there, wasn't meant to see what the water couldn't hide. The long pale lines across her back that spoke of years no one talked about out loud. Not fresh, not loud, but permanent in the way only certain kinds of history can be. And Elias froze. Not because he was afraid, but because he understood something in that instant that most men never do. That some secrets aren't meant to be uncovered, even by accident. And Clara felt it too. The shift in the air, the presence behind her, her body going still in a way that had nothing to do with surprise and everything to do with recognition. Like she'd lived long enough to know exactly what it meant to be seen. And slowly, without turning fully, she reached for the edge of the water as if deciding whether to disappear into it or stand her ground. And Elias did the only thing he could think of that wouldn't make things worse. He stepped back, slow, deliberate, boots pressing into the dirt without a sound, eyes lowering not out of shame but out of respect. And he removed his coat, worn leather softened by years of use, placing it over a nearby rock within her reach, a quiet offering. No words, no explanation, just a choice. And then he turned his back completely and walked away, each step measured, giving her space she didn't ask for but clearly needed. And as he mounted his horse again, the wind picked up just enough to carry the faint sound of water moving behind him, like the world resetting itself, like nothing had happened. But Elias knew better, because for the first time in a decade, something had entered his land that he couldn't ignore, and something in him, long silent, had started to stir again. By the time Elias Crow reached his cabin, the sun had already climbed high enough to burn the morning chill out of the air, but something colder had followed him back across those 2 miles of dry land, settling into the quiet spaces he had spent years keeping empty. And he could not shake the feeling that the silence around him had changed, like it was listening now instead of resting. He tied his horse the same way he always did, checked the same fence line, poured the same cup of black coffee into the same chipped tin mug, but none of it landed the way it used to, because for the first time in 10 years, his mind kept drifting back to something he did not invite. The image of her standing in that shallow creek, still as stone, carrying a history she never spoke. And Elias understood something he had avoided for a long time. That loneliness was easier when it belonged only to him, not when it walked in from somewhere else and asked to be seen. He stepped out onto the porch and looked across the open land, miles of nothing stretching under a sky too wide for most men to bear. And he told himself it was over, that she would leave like everything else did, passing through without leaving a mark. But even as he thought it, his eyes drifted toward the east, toward the thin line of trees that marked the creek, and the wind carried something faint, not a sound exactly, more like the absence of one. The kind of quiet that only comes when someone is hiding, waiting, choosing whether to stay or disappear. The afternoon dragged slow, each hour heavier than the last, and Elias found himself doing things twice, checking doors that were already closed, stepping outside for no reason other than to listen. And as the light began to fade, the sky turning that deep amber that made everything look softer than it really was, he noticed something near the edge of his land, a shape where there should not have been one, still and uncertain against the fence line. And he did not move right away, because out here, sudden movement meant questions you might not want answered. So he stood there, watching, letting the distance speak first, and after a long moment, the shape shifted just enough to become a person, a woman, and even from that far, he recognized the way she held herself, like someone who expected to be told to leave before she even took a step forward. Clara Whitlock did not call out, did not wave, did not ask for anything. She simply stood there at the edge of his land, as if the boundary itself meant more to her than it did to him. And Elias felt something tighten in his chest, not fear, not anger, something quieter, something that had been missing long enough that he almost did not recognize it. And he realized she had not come for shelter the way most people would, not out of desperation or demand, but out of a kind of hesitation that made her presence feel heavier than any request. And as the last of the sunlight slipped behind the hills, leaving the land in that soft gray between day and night, Elias set his mug down on the porch railing and took one slow step forward, not toward her, but toward a decision he had spent years avoiding. Because out here, a man could survive by staying alone, but sometimes survival was not the same as living, and Clara Whitlock was standing at the edge of his land like a question he could no longer ignore. She did not cross the fence, not even a single step, and that was the first thing Elias Crow noticed as he walked off his porch and into the cooling dusk, the distance between them holding steady like an unspoken rule she refused to break, and for a long moment neither of them said anything, the wind moving through the dry grass, the faint creak of wood behind him, the kind of silence that did not feel empty anymore, but weighed on the chest like something waiting to be answered. Clara Whitlock kept her hands at her sides, not raised, not hidden, just still, her posture carrying that same quiet tension he had seen at the creek, like she was ready to leave the second she was told to. And Elias slowed his steps until he stopped several yards away, far enough to give her space, close enough to see the dust on her boots, the faint tremble she tried to hide, and the coat he had left behind earlier now folded carefully over her arm, as if it mattered more than anything else she owned. "You should not be here," he said, his voice low, not harsh, just honest in the way a man speaks when he has lived too long without needing to soften his words. And Clara lowered her gaze for a second before meeting his eyes again, not defiant, not afraid, just steady in a way that made it harder for him to look away. "I will leave if you want me to," she said, each word measured, careful, like she had learned long ago that saying too much could cost more than silence ever would. And Elias felt something shift inside him, not because of what she said, but because of how quickly she was willing to disappear, as if she had already accepted the answer before asking the question. The light was almost gone now, the horizon fading into a deep blue that swallowed details and left only shapes and outlines. And Elias glanced past her toward the open land beyond the fence, the long stretch of nothing that led to places most people never came back from. And he knew that if she turned around and walked into it, no one would follow, no one would ask, and no one would remember. And for years that had been the kind of world he had chosen to live in, simple, quiet, untouched, but standing there now, with Clara Whitlock waiting at the edge of it, that choice did not feel as solid as it used to. He took one more step forward, slow enough that she could see it coming, and he nodded toward the coat. In her arms, "You kept it clean," he said, a small thing, but it was all he had to offer in that moment. And Clara looked down at the worn leather, her fingers tightening slightly around it before she held it out toward him, not stepping closer, just extending it across the distance like a line she would not cross without permission. Elias did not take it right away. Instead, he looked at her, really looked this time, at the way she stood, at the way she waited, and he realized something that settled deep and quiet in his chest, that she was not asking for help the way most people did. She was asking for a chance not to be turned away, and that was a different kind of request entirely, one that did not come with words or demands, just presence. "Keep it," he said finally, his voice softer now, almost lost in the wind, and for the first time since she appeared, Clara's expression shifted, not into relief, not into gratitude, but into something smaller, something careful, like hope that had not been used in a long time. And Elias turned slightly toward the house behind him, the door still open, a faint light spilling out into the dark, and without looking back at her again, he spoke the words that would change everything that followed. "You can come closer if you want." And the space between them, the fence, the silence, All of it seemed to hold its breath as Clara Whitlock decided whether or not to step into a place she had never been invited to before. Clara Whitlock did not move right away, and that hesitation said more than anything she could have spoken, her eyes drifting past Elias Crow toward the open door behind him, where a soft yellow light spilled out onto the porch, steady and warm in a way that did not belong to the rest of the land. And for a moment, she looked like someone standing at the edge of something she had never been allowed to touch. Measuring the distance not in steps, but in consequences, the wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of dry earth and old wood. And Elias waited without urging her, because he understood that whatever brought her here had already pushed her far enough, and anything more would have to be her choice. Slowly, almost carefully, Clara took one step forward, her boot pressing into the dust just inside the boundary she had refused to cross before, and then another, each movement deliberate, like she was learning how to walk into a place that did not immediately push back, and Elias stepped aside without a word, giving her a clear path toward the house, his posture relaxed but watchful, not guarding the space from her, but holding it open. She reached the bottom step and paused again, her gaze lifting briefly to meet his before shifting toward the doorway. And there was something in that look, not fear, not quite trust, but something in between that made the moment feel heavier than it should have been, like the simple act of entering carried weight neither of them could fully name. Inside, the cabin was exactly what it had always been, one room worn smooth by time, a table with two chairs though only one had been used in years, a cast-iron stove in the corner still holding the last of the day's heat, and a narrow bed against the far wall that had never needed to be shared. And Clara stepped across the threshold like someone expecting the space to change once she was inside, like it might reject her the way other places had. But nothing shifted, nothing closed, nothing broke, and that seemed to catch her off guard more than anything else. Elias moved past her then, slow and steady, setting another cup on the table and pouring what remained of his coffee into it. The sound quiet but grounding, and he placed it within reach before stepping back again, not watching her drink, not asking her to, just leaving the option there the same way he had left the coat by the creek. And Clara stood there for a long second before her fingers finally curled around the cup, the warmth sinking into her hands as if it had been waiting for her. And when she took a small sip, her shoulders lowered just slightly, a shift so small most men would have missed it, but Elias noticed. Because out here, small things were the only things that lasted. The silence between them returned, but it was different now, not empty, not heavy, just present, like something shared rather than endured. And Clara's eyes moved across the room, slowly, taking in the details, the worn edges, the untouched corners, the life that had been paused for too long. And she spoke again, her voice softer this time, almost uncertain. "You live here alone," and Elias nodded once, not offering more, because there was nothing to explain, and she looked back at him, holding the cup with both hands now, as if it anchored her in place. And for the first time since she had stepped onto his land, she did not look like she was ready to leave, and Elias realized in that quiet moment that something had already changed, not in the land, not in the house, but in the space between two people who had spent too long believing they were better off alone. And outside, the night settled in fully, wrapping the cabin in darkness, while inside, a single light burned steady, holding back more than just the dark. The night did not feel as long as it used to, and that was the first thing Elias Crow noticed as the hours passed quietly inside the cabin. The usual weight of darkness replaced by something steadier, something that did not press down on him the way it had for years. And across the table, Clara Whitlock sat with her hands wrapped around the empty cup, not asking for more, not speaking unless necessary, but no longer holding herself like she might vanish at any second. And that small shift changed the room more than any fire ever could. Elias moved about the space with the same measured rhythm he had always kept, setting another log into the stove, checking the latch on the door, small habits that once filled the silence but now seemed to share it. And every so often his eyes drifted toward her without turning his head, just enough to confirm she was still there, still real, still choosing to stay. Clara watched him too, though less directly, her gaze following the edges of his movements, learning the room the way someone learns a place they might not be allowed to keep, noting where things were, how he moved, what he did not say, and after a long stretch of quiet, she finally spoke again, her voice low but clearer than before. "How long have you been out here?" And Elias paused just long enough to consider whether the question deserved an answer before replying. 10 years, maybe a little more. The words simple, but carrying more distance than time alone could explain. Clara nodded once, absorbing that, as if she understood something behind it without needing the details, and she looked down at her hands, fingers tracing the rim of the cup in a slow, absent motion, like someone grounding themselves in something solid, and the silence returned again. But this time it did not feel uncertain. It felt like space being shared without demand. Outside, the wind moved across the land in long, low passes, brushing against the cabin walls, and Elias stepped toward the small window, glancing out into the dark, a habit he had never broken. But tonight there was a difference, because for the first time in years he was not checking for threats or trouble. He was checking because there was something inside worth protecting, and that realization settled in quietly, without force, but with a weight he could not ignore. When he turned back, Clara had shifted slightly, her shoulders no longer tight, her posture easing into the chair as if her body was slowly remembering what it meant not to be ready to leave. And Elias walked to the far side of the room, pulling a folded blanket from a shelf and placing it carefully on the edge of the bed without comment, not offering it directly, not making it a question, just leaving it there the same way he had left everything else. Simple, open, without pressure, and Clara followed the motion with her eyes, understanding without needing it explained. "You do not ask questions," she said after a moment, not accusing, just noticing, and Elias shook his head slightly, his voice quiet but certain, not the kind that need answers right away, and something in that response settled into the room like a final piece falling into place, because for someone who had lived too long being asked things she could not safely answer, the absence of questions felt like something close to trust. The fire cracked softly in the corner, the lights steady and warm, and as the night stretched on, neither of them moved to end it, because out there, beyond the walls, the world still waited with all the things it always carried. But inside, for the first time in a very long while, there was no urgency, no expectation, just two people sitting in a space that had not been built for company, slowly becoming something it had never been before. Morning came quietly, not with a sudden burst of light, but with a slow, steady glow that crept through the thin curtains and settled across the wooden floor. And Elias Crow was already awake before the sun cleared the horizon, sitting at the edge of the porch with his usual cup in hand. Though today the routine felt different, not broken, just shared, as if the land itself had noticed there was more than one set of footsteps inside the cabin. He did not look back right away, but he could hear it, the faint movement behind him, careful, measured, like someone still deciding how much space they were allowed to take. And when Clara Whitlock stepped into the doorway, she paused there, just as she had the night before, not out of fear this time, but out of habit, as if thresholds had always meant something complicated in her life. The air was cooler than the night before, carrying the clean scent of early morning, and Elias nodded once toward the open land without turning fully, a quiet acknowledgement that she was there, that she had stayed. And Clara stepped onto the porch, her boots softer against the wood than his ever were, her eyes scanning the horizon as if measuring the distance in a different way than he did, not as land to be worked or watched, but as something to be understood. "You always wake before the sun," she said, her voice steady now, less guarded, and Elias gave a small nod, eyes fixed ahead. "Easier that way," he replied, and she considered that for a moment, as if there was more behind those words than he had offered. The silence that followed was not empty. It held something quieter, something almost settled, like two people learning the shape of a shared morning without needing to fill it. And after a while Clara stepped down from the porch, her boots touching the dirt just beyond the steps, and she moved slowly, not wandering, just walking along the edge of the fence as if tracing the boundary she had once refused to cross, and Elias watched her. Then, openly this time, noticing the way she paused to touch the rough wood, the way she looked out across the land without flinching, and he realized she was not just passing through, she was learning it, the same way he had once done, years ago, when the silence had still felt like something new. After a few minutes she turned back toward him, the early light catching in her hair, softening the lines that had seemed so sharp the day before, and she spoke again, her tone quieter but certain. "I can help." The words simple, but carrying a weight that made Elias set his cup down, because out here, help was not something offered lightly. It was something earned, something that changed the balance of a place, and he studied her for a moment, not questioning her ability, not doubting her intent, but considering what it meant to let someone else into a life that had been built on solitude. "There's work," he said finally, his voice even. "Always is," and Clara gave a small nod, as if that was all she needed to hear. No agreement, no conditions, just acknowledgement, and she stepped back, toward the cabin, not waiting for instruction, not asking where to begin, simply moving with the quiet understanding that being allowed to stay meant finding a way to belong. And Elias watched her go, something steady settling in his chest again, not the old silence he had known, but something new, something that carried both weight and warmth. And as the sun finally broke over the horizon, casting long shadows across the land, Elias Crow realized that for the first time in a long while, the day ahead did not feel like something to endure alone. Work began without instruction, and that was what surprised Elias Crow most as the morning stretched into something warmer, something alive with quiet movement. Because Clara Whitlock did not wait to be told where to stand or what to do. She simply watched once, learned, and then stepped into the rhythm of the place as if she had been studying it long before she arrived. He found her near the water barrel, adjusting the position of the bucket so it would not tip against the uneven ground. Her movements efficient, careful, not rushed, and when she noticed him watching, she did not stop. She only nodded once as if to say she understood the work without needing to prove it, and Elias gave a small nod back, because out here, words were often less useful than quiet understanding. The sun climbed higher, pulling the coolness out of the air and replacing it with a dry heat that settled across the land. And together they moved through the small tasks that kept the ranch standing, checking the fence posts along the eastern edge, gathering loose boards, tightening what had come undone over time. And there was a steadiness in the way Clara worked that Elias recognized immediately, not strength in the loud sense, but endurance, the kind that came from having no choice but to continue. At one point, she paused near a broken section of fence where the wood had splintered and worn thin, and she crouched slightly, running her hand along the grain as if reading it. And without looking back, she said, "This has been like this for a while." And Elias stepped closer, glancing down at the same place he had passed a dozen times without fixing, because it had never felt urgent enough when there was only one person relying on it. And he nodded once, longer than it needed to be, before reaching for the tools he had left leaning against the post. They worked side by side then, not speaking, not needing to, passing pieces of wood, holding the structure steady, each movement fitting into the next with a quiet precision that did not come from practice together, but from something simpler. A shared intention to keep something standing. When the final board was set in place, Clara stepped back slightly, wiping her hands against her worn sleeves, and she looked at the fence as if measuring not just its strength, but what it meant to repair something that had been left unattended. And Elias followed her gaze, seeing it differently now, not as another task completed, but as a sign of something shifting, something no longer being carried by one set of hands alone. The wind moved softly through the grass again, carrying the distant sound of nothing but open land, and for a moment they both stood there, looking out across it, the repaired fence at their backs, the wide horizon ahead, and Clara spoke quietly, almost to herself, "It feels different out here," and Elias glanced at her, not questioning, just listening, and after a second he answered, "It is," and that was all that needed to be said, because the land had not changed. The distance had not shortened, but something within it had, something small and steady that did not demand attention, but made itself known all the same. As they turned back toward the cabin, the light shifting into that late morning brightness that softened the edges of everything it touched, Elias realized that the work they had done was not about the fence at all. It was about something far less visible, something being rebuilt quietly. Between two people who had both spent too long believing that nothing broken was worth fixing unless it had to be, and now, without either of them saying it, that belief was beginning to give way. The afternoon settled into a slow, steady rhythm, the kind that made time stretch without anyone noticing. And Elias Crow found himself working in a way he had not in years, not faster, not harder, just more aware, because every small movement now had a second set of eyes following it, learning it, and sometimes improving it without asking. Clara Whitlock moved through the yard with a quiet certainty that did not belong to someone new, pausing only long enough to observe before stepping in, adjusting the angle of a loose gate so it would close without catching, stacking split wood in a way that kept it dry from the ground up, small things that spoke of experience without explanation, and Elias watched without interrupting, because there was something in the way she worked that did not invite correction, only recognition. The sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the land, and the heat began to soften into something more forgiving. And for a while neither of them spoke. The silence filled instead with the sounds of work, boots shifting on dirt, wood settling into place, the faint creak of rope as it tightened, all of it forming a quiet language that did not need translation. Near the far edge of the yard, Clara stopped again, her gaze fixed beyond the fence line, and Elias noticed the shift immediately, not in her posture, but in the stillness that followed, the kind that came when attention moved from what was close to something farther away, something not yet visible but already felt. He walked toward her without hurry, stopping a few feet behind, not asking what she saw, just standing there long enough for the answer to come on its own. And after a moment she spoke, her voice lower now, more measured than before. "Someone has been riding out there." The words quiet, but certain, and Elias narrowed his eyes slightly, scanning the distant line where the land met the sky. And at first there was nothing, just the same endless stretch he had looked at every day. But then he saw it. Faint marks in the dust where the wind had not yet erased them, a pattern too deliberate to be random, too recent to ignore. He did not react right away, not outwardly, because out here, reacting too quickly could turn something distant into something closer than it needed to be. But inside, something shifted, not fear, not alarm, just awareness, sharp and immediate, the kind that had kept him alive long before he chose this quiet life. Clara did not look at him when she spoke again, but her words carried the weight of someone who understood what those marks meant. "They are not passing through." And Elias nodded once, slow, deliberate, because he saw it now too. The way the tracks curved slightly, not cutting across the land but circling it, observing rather than traveling. And that meant something different entirely. The wind picked up just enough to blur the edges of the tracks, as if the land itself was trying to hide what it could not fully erase. And Elias turned back toward the cabin, his eyes moving across the familiar space with a new layer of attention, measuring distance, checking angles, small things that had once been routine, but now carried purpose again. And Clara remained where she was for a moment longer before following, her steps steady, not rushed, but no longer wandering. As they reached the porch, the light beginning to fade into that soft gold that came before evening, Elias paused, his hand resting briefly against the wood, and he spoke without looking at her. "We will finish the rest tomorrow." And Clara nodded once, understanding the words for what they were, not a delay, not an excuse, but a quiet acknowledgement that something had changed, that the stillness of this place had been noticed by more than just them. And as they stepped inside, the door closing softly behind them, the land outside seemed to stretch wider than before, not empty, but waiting, as if it knew that whatever had begun at the creek had not yet reached its end. The night settled heavier than the one before, not louder, not colder, but different in a way Elias Crow could feel in the stillness between each sound, like the land itself had begun to listen more closely. And inside the cabin the fire burned low, its light steady but no longer enough to push away the awareness that something beyond the walls had taken notice. Clara Whitlock sat near the table again, her hands resting flat against the wood this time, not holding anything, not anchoring herself to an object, but to the space itself, and her eyes moved toward the window every few minutes, not out of fear, but out of habit, the kind that came from knowing that quiet did not always mean safe. Elias stood near the door, not guarding it, but closer than usual, his posture relaxed to anyone who might look in, but ready in the way a man becomes when he recognizes a pattern returning. And he spoke without turning, his voice low, steady. "They circled once today," and Clara nodded, slightly, her gaze still on the dark glass. "They will come closer," she said, not guessing, not questioning, just stating what she already knew, and Elias accepted that without argument. Because the tracks had told the same story, slow, deliberate, testing distance before closing it. The fire cracked softly, the only sound for a long moment, and then Elias moved to the shelf, reaching for a second lantern he had not used in years, lighting it with a careful motion and placing it near the back of the room where the shadows gathered most, not to brighten the space, but to remove the places where something could hide, and Clara watched that small act closely, understanding what it meant without needing him to explain, because she had lived in places where light was not just comfort, but choice. After a while she spoke again, her voice quieter now, but more certain than it had been when she first arrived. If they come here, they will not ask. And Elias finally turned to look at her fully, his expression unchanged, not hardened, not softened, just clear in a way that did not leave room for doubt. Then we do not answer, he said. And the words settled into the room like something final, not defiant, not reckless, but steady, like a line drawn without needing to be seen. Clara held his gaze for a moment longer than before, and something passed between them then, not spoken, not named, but understood, the kind of understanding that did not come from time, but from choice. And she gave a small nod before looking back toward the window, the reflection of the firelight catching in her eyes, steady now, not searching for an escape, but measuring what might come. Outside, the wind shifted again, carrying a faint sound across the open land, too distant to define, too deliberate to ignore, and Elias stepped onto the porch without hesitation, his boots quiet against the wood, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond the fence line. And for a long moment there was nothing, just the vast stretch of land under a sky that held no answers. And then, far off near the eastern ridge, a small movement, barely visible, but enough to confirm what they both already knew, that whatever had been watching had not left. He stood there a while longer, not moving, not reacting, just observing, because out here, patience was not a virtue, it was survival. And when he finally turned back toward the door, the light from inside falling across the threshold, he paused for just a second, his hand resting against the frame, as if marking the place in his mind. And then he stepped back inside, closing the door softly behind him, not to shut the world out, but to make a decision about what would be allowed to come in. And for the first time since the tracks appeared, Elias Crow did not feel like he was protecting a piece of land. He felt like he was protecting something that had only just begun to exist. The first sound came just before dawn, not loud, not sudden, but deliberate enough to wake a man who had trained himself to notice the difference between wind and intention. And Elias Crow opened his eyes without moving, listening to the space around him before even glancing toward the door. The fire long reduced to a faint glow, the air holding that cold edge that came just before sunrise. Across the room, Clara Whitlock was already awake, sitting upright on the edge of the bed, her posture still but alert, as if she had been listening longer than he had. And when their eyes met, no words were needed, because whatever had been distant the night before had now come closer. The second sound followed, softer, a shift in the dirt outside, measured, controlled, not the wandering of an animal, but the kind of movement that understood where it was stepping. And Elias rose slowly, his boots touching the floor without a creak, his hand brushing briefly against the table as he moved toward the door, not rushing, not hesitating, just stepping into the moment the same way he had stepped into every difficult thing in his life, steady and without show. Clara stood as well, not moving toward him, not staying behind, but positioning herself where she could see both the door and the window, her breathing even, her gaze fixed. And there was something different in her now, not the guarded distance from before, but a quiet readiness that did not come from fear, but from knowing exactly what it meant to be found. The room held its breath as Elias reached the door, his hand resting against the wood for a brief second, feeling the faint vibration of movement on the other side. And then, instead of opening it, he stepped back, turning slightly toward Clara, his voice low but clear. "They are here," and she gave a small nod, not surprised, not shaken, just confirming what she had already known since the night before. The light outside had begun to shift, the first pale line of morning stretching across the horizon, casting a thin glow through the edges of the window. And Elias moved to the side of the room, lifting the second lantern and setting it near the door, not to reveal what was outside, but to make sure nothing inside was hidden, and Clara watched that small act with a steady gaze, understanding again without words, because some choices did not need explanation. The third sound came then, closer, a pause just beyond the door, as if whoever stood there was considering the space, measuring it the same way Elias had measured the land for years, and then, a single knock, not forceful, not rushed, just firm enough to be heard, and the quiet that followed carried more weight than the sound itself. Elias did not move immediately. He did not answer. He simply stood there, his eyes on the door, his posture calm in a way that did not invite challenge but did not yield either, and behind him, Clara remained still, her presence no longer uncertain, no longer temporary, but anchored in the space as if she had already made her choice. Another knock came, identical to the first, patient, deliberate, and Elias finally stepped forward, not to open the door, but to stand directly in front of it, close enough to hear the faint breath of whoever waited outside. And he spoke through the wood, his voice steady, unraised. "You have no business here." And for a moment there was nothing, no response, no movement, just the quiet stretch of land holding its silence. And then, from the other side, a voice answered, calm, measured, "We are only looking for someone." And Elias did not turn, did not glance back, because he already knew who they meant. And in that moment, standing between the door and the only place that had begun to feel like more than just shelter, he understood something with absolute clarity, that whatever came next would not be decided by who was outside, but by what he chose to protect inside. The silence after the voice did not break. It deepened, stretching across the small space between the door and the two people inside. And Elias Crow stood there without shifting, his hand no longer touching the wood, but close enough to feel the presence on the other side. And he did not raise his voice when he answered, did not add weight or threat to it, because out here, men who needed to sound strong usually were not. "She is not here," he said, simple, steady, and behind him Clara Whitlock did not move, did not speak, but something in her posture changed, not fear, not retreat, but a quiet stillness that came from understanding exactly what that sentence meant and what it might cost. Outside, the man on the other side of the door let the words settle for a moment, as if testing them, measuring their truth not by what was said, but by how it was said. And when he spoke again, his tone did not sharpen, it remained calm, almost respectful. "We have followed her a long way," and Elias closed his eyes for just a second, not in hesitation, but in recognition of what kind of men spoke like that, the kind who did not rush, who did not push harder than needed, because they believed time was already on their side. The faint light of early morning crept further into the room, softening the edges of everything it touched, and Elias opened his eyes again, his gaze fixed on the door as if he could see through it, and his voice came once more, just as even as before, "Then you have followed the wrong trail," and this time, there was a longer pause, the kind that held more than silence, the kind that carried decision. Clara shifted slightly behind him, just one step, not toward the door, not away from it, but closer to the center of the room, and Elias heard it without turning, the small sound of movement that told him she was no longer standing at the edge of anything. She had already chosen where she stood. Outside, a second voice joined the first, quieter, harder to place, saying nothing at first, just present, and then a soft exchange between them that did not carry through the door, only the rhythm of it, low, measured, deliberate, and Elias waited, because this was the part where most men would fill the silence, would explain, would justify. But he had learned long ago that explanation gave others something to hold, something to pull apart, and so he offered nothing more. The wind moved across the land again, brushing against the cabin walls, carrying dust and distance with it, and the first voice returned, closer now, as if the man had stepped just slightly nearer to the door. "If she comes here, you will send her away," he said, not a question, not quite a command, something in between that tried to place the choice in Elias's hands without admitting it. And Elias let that settle for a moment, not rushing to answer, because the truth was not something he needed to build, it was something he had already decided. When he spoke, his voice did not rise, did not harden, it remained exactly as it had been from the beginning. "No, And that single word held the room in place, simple, unbroken, final in a way that did not invite argument. Behind him, Clara closed her eyes for just a second, not in relief, not in fear, but in recognition, because she had heard many answers in her life, but never one that did not ask for something in return. Outside, the quiet stretched again, longer this time, heavier, and then the faint sound of boots shifting in the dirt, not retreating, not advancing, just adjusting, as if the men beyond the door were reconsidering something they had expected to be easier. And Elias remained where he stood, not moving, not preparing for anything beyond the moment itself, because he understood now that whatever came next would not be decided by force or speed, but by who was willing to remain standing in the space they had chosen. And for the first time since the knock came, the balance had shifted, not loudly, not visibly, but enough that even the silence could feel it. The quiet on the other side of the door did not break into anger, and that was what made it heavier, because men who did not raise their voices were often the ones who had already decided how things would end. And Elias Crow stood where he was, not bracing, not shifting, just holding the space as if it belonged to him in a way that did not need to be proven. The first voice returned, softer now, almost thoughtful. "You were choosing this," he said, and Elias did not answer right away, not because he was unsure, but because some things did not need to be spoken twice. And behind him Clara Whitlock remained still, her presence no longer something he was aware of in pieces, but something whole, something that stood with him without stepping forward or pulling away. The light in the room had grown stronger, the pale morning now reaching across the floor, touching the legs of the table, the edge of the bed, the place where Clara stood, and Elias realized that whatever had come to his door had not arrived in darkness. It had waited for the day, for clarity, for a moment where choices would be seen for what they were. Outside, the faint sound of movement shifted again, not closer, not farther, just a change in weight, as if the men beyond the door were no longer testing the boundary, but considering it, and the second voice spoke for the first time in a way that carried through, low and even. "There are easier paths than this." And Elias let out a slow breath, not tired, not strained, just steady. And he replied without raising his voice, "Maybe, but not mine." And the words settled into the wood, into the space between them, into something that did not need agreement to be true. Clara lowered her gaze for a moment, her hands resting loosely at her sides now. No tension in them, no readiness to flee. And Elias could feel the shift without turning, the way her stillness had changed from guarded to grounded, as if the room itself had given her something she had not expected to find. Outside, the wind moved again, stronger now, lifting dust from the ground, carrying it across the open land in thin lines that blurred the tracks that had led them here. And for a moment there was nothing but that sound, the soft rush of air against earth. And then the first voice returned, closer than before, not to the door, but to the decision itself. "If we leave, she will still be followed," he said, not as a warning, not as a threat, but as a statement of fact. And Elias closed his eyes for just a second, not to think, but to accept that truth as something that would not change. And when he opened them again, his voice came quiet and certain, "Then she will not be alone." And those words did not rise, did not echo, but they carried a weight that settled deeper than anything said before. The silence that followed was different now, not tense, not waiting, but resolved in a way that did not need further testing. And after a long moment, the sound of boots shifted again, this time not adjusting, but turning, the faint crunch of dirt marking a direction away from the door, and the presence outside began to fade, not quickly, not dramatically, just step by step, as if the decision had been accepted without needing to be challenged further. Elias did not move right away. He did not open the door. He did not follow. He simply stood there until the last trace of sound disappeared into the distance. And only then did he step back, his hand falling away from the space where the door had been his boundary. And behind him Clara let out a breath she had not realized she was holding, soft, steady. And when Elias finally turned to face her, there was no question in his eyes, no need to ask what came next, because something had already been decided long before the knock, long before the voices, something that had begun the moment he chose not to look away at the creek. And now, standing in the quiet that followed, That choice had become something neither of them would have to face alone. The morning did not rush in after they left. It arrived the same way it always had, slow and certain, light stretching across the land inch by inch, touching the fence, the porch, the worn wood of the cabin, as if nothing had happened at all, and Elias Crow stepped outside just after sunrise, not to check for anything, not to confirm they were gone, but because it was what he had always done, the habit of a man who once believed routine was enough to keep the world at a distance. Clara. Whitlock followed a few steps behind, not hesitating at the doorway this time, not pausing at the edge, just stepping into the morning like she belonged to it, her eyes moving across the land without searching for escape, without measuring distance, simply seeing it for what it was, open, quiet, and no longer something she had to outrun. The wind moved gently through the grass, carrying away the last faint traces of tracks that had circled the place the day before, softening the ground until it looked untouched again, and Elias noticed it without stopping, because some things did not need to be preserved to matter. Some things were meant to disappear once they had done their part. They walked toward the fence together, the repaired section holding firm in the early light, the wood catching the sun in a way that made it stand out against the older posts, and Clara reached out, resting her hand against it for a brief moment, not checking its strength, but acknowledging it, and Elias watched that small gesture with a quiet understanding, because he knew it was not the fence she was recognizing. It was what it meant to fix something and have it stay that way. After a while she spoke, her voice calm, steady in a way that no longer carried the edge of uncertainty. They will not come back today. And Elias nodded once, not because he was certain, but because it did not change anything either way, and he looked out across the land, the same miles of distance he had known for years, but it did not feel as wide as it used to, not empty, not isolating, just space, open and waiting. Clara stepped a little farther out, past the line she had once refused to cross, her boots leaving clear marks in the dust, not hiding them, not erasing them, and she turned slightly back toward him, not asking a question, not seeking permission, just meeting his gaze in a way that carried something simple and unspoken. Elias took a step forward then, closing the distance between where he had always stood and where he had never allowed anyone else to stand before, and he stopped beside her, not in front, not behind, just there, the two of them facing the same horizon without needing to explain what that meant. The sun rose higher, the light warming the ground beneath their feet, and somewhere in the distance a bird cut across the sky, a small movement against something vast, and neither of them spoke for a long moment, because there was nothing left to decide, nothing left to prove, only the quiet understanding that had settled between them, steady and real. After a while Elias turned back toward the cabin, not out of habit this time, but with intention, and Clara followed without hesitation, her steps even, her presence no longer temporary. And as they reached the porch, he paused just long enough to glance at the open door, the space inside no longer defined by emptiness. And then he stepped through, holding it open without looking back, and Clara crossed the threshold beside him, not as someone seeking shelter, but as someone who had finally found a place that did not ask her to be anything other than who she was. And the door remained open behind them, the morning light spilling in, touching every corner of the room, as if the land itself had decided that some things were worth keeping, not because they were claimed, but because they were chosen.